like to introduce yourself quickly, and then you can jump right into it if you want.
Sure thing. So a lot of this presentation is actually going to be about me in ways that are going to seem like potentially self-serving, but I promise they're not in the end. So you'll learn a lot about me before we're done today. But my name is Allan Austin. I'm a professor of history at Misericordia University. You probably know a little bit about Ms. because Mr. Grybos is your teacher and whatnot. I specialize in immigration history and pop culture history. Gosh, what else is there to know about me? My most recent book was a book I co-authored with an English professor here that's a history of race and the American superhero, which is kind of a blending of the work I do. And I just really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. So I know you're all kind of gathered in the back of the room there, but I will warn you as I get started, the more I've taught, the more my teaching style has become conversational as opposed to lecture based. So please, like if you have comments or questions at any point as I'm just kind of rambling on, please jump in, make your voice heard. Nobody wants to just listen to me like go on for too long. So a lot of my work is focused on Japanese American history. That'll become clear in a couple of minutes when I ask you to do some work with me. But when Mr. Grybos asked me to come, we knocked around a lot of ideas and we sort of settled on the idea of why does history matter? If Mr. Grybos asked me, why am I here today? I could almost pick the exact moment in my life that put me on the track that I'm on. So I'm going to tell you again, I told you I was going to talk too much about myself. So let me start with a story about myself. When I was like roundabout your age, when I was a senior in high school, I did the worst college search that any human being has ever done. I didn't know what I was supposed to do to look for a college. My parents were really clear, like in my family, it was clear I was going to college, but I didn't know how to get there. I didn't know what I wanted. I was completely unfocused. Like I didn't know anything about myself or what I thought that I might want. So kind of at the last minute, I had this guidance counselor at my school who said, you really ought to apply to a state school. So at the last minute, I applied to Bowling Green State University. I grew up in Ohio, so I applied to an Ohio school. If you don't know Bowling Green, it's out near Toledo, Ohio. And so I applied late and I got a letter because, again, I'm old, like there was no email. I got a physical letter and I opened up the envelope and it said, thank you for applying, but you've applied too late. You're on the wait list. So I was like, well, whatever. What do I care about Bowling Green? Then about a week later, I get a second letter and I open up this envelope and it says, hey, just like ignore the last letter we sent. You've been accepted to Bowling Green and we're giving you a free ride. And I'm talking about, and I say this like with some trepidation because they don't exist anymore. Like they offered to pay my tuition, my fees, my room, my board. I was going to have 4 years of college for free. And I didn't know anything about doing a college search, but my parents knew what free meant, right? Like there was no doubt at that point, like I was going to Bowling Green. So, but again, you have to remember me as the guy that like I'm not very focused. I don't really know who I am. I was the last person in my class of like 4,000 students to sign up for classes. I got the worst first year schedule ever put together that included some kind of math class that met 4 days a week at 7:30 in the morning. Like it was brutal. But one of the classes I got thrown into at the last minute was a history class. It was called Totalitarianism in the 20th Century. And it was taught by a historian named Larry Friedman. And it was exactly what it sounds like. It was like a tour of all the bloodiest dictators in world history. We did Mussolini and Hitler and Stalin and Pol Pot, and like the whole range of them we did. And midway through the semester, we sat down to read a book called The Tin Drum, written by a German author named Günter Grass. Now, you don't need to read The Tin Drum, but I will tell you, it is a very dense, complicated, layered novel. But we were honor students, right? So like we read it because we were supposed to read it. And we showed up for class. And when we met that day, we were sitting in a circle. And Larry Friedman says, I have only one question you have to answer today. It was a Tuesday, Thursday class. We had 75 minutes. Answer the question, he says, and we're done. The main character in the tin drum is a little kid named Oscar. And Larry asked us that day, he said, does Oscar symbolize Jesus Christ or does he symbolize Satan in this story? And as it just happened, like coincidentally, the class split right down the middle. Half of the students were 100% convinced that Oscar was Jesus, and the other half were 100% convinced that Oscar was Satan. And I'm sure your teachers kind of respect the question that Larry asked that day because nobody was able to take the middle ground, right? You can't argue. I think Oscar is a little bit of Jesus and a little bit of Satan, right? It can't be that. It's Jesus or Satan. It's good or bad. It's black or it's white. And we argued about it for the entirety of the class. Like if we thought we were getting out early, we were wrong. Like, and a miracle happened that day. I don't know if you guys do this in Mr. Gribos's class or not, but when you get to college, one of the things people do when there's about 5 minutes left in class is they start packing up their backpacks to kind of like send a signal to the faculty that like, hey, it's time to go. Nobody started to pack up that day. We went full time. Nobody's packing up. We're 5 minutes over and still nobody's packing up because Larry Friedman had made us really care about what this book meant. Like it was like we not only read it, we now cared about the book. We felt like if we understood this book, somehow we would better understand the Nazi regime or we would better understand humanity, like on some level. And so finally, there's a long line of students outside the door of the classroom waiting to come in for the next class. So Larry Friedman just dismisses class. He says, great work. I'll see you all on Tuesday or whatever. He dismisses us. Still, nobody gets up to leave because we all want to know the answer to one question, right? Like, which is it? You've made us debate the meaning of the tin drum. You've made us care about Oscar and what he symbolizes. Is it Jesus or is it Satan? Tell us the answer. This is the defining moment of my professional life, which is maybe a little embarrassing, but like I'm telling you the story. So here we go. We're sitting in a circle. We're having this argument. We demand of Larry Friedman, what's the answer to this question? And he rolled his eyes to the ceiling and he said, and this is a direct quote, I remember the story like it were yesterday when I tell it. He rolled his eyes to the ceiling and Larry said, well, I don't know what the hell the answer is. And when Larry Friedman said, I don't know what the hell the answer is, something clicked in my brain and I said, that's what I want to do for the rest of my life. Now, maybe I didn't fully understand what it was, but what he introduced me to that day was that the study of history was not like I had been trained to think of it. The study of history did not consist of memorizing a bunch of names and dates and then showing up with a number 2 pencil for a Scantron test and vomiting them back, right? That history was not just rote memorization. History is an ongoing argument, or if you're uncomfortable with the idea of arguing, it's an ongoing conversation. The questions we ask may change over time. The answers we come to are definitely going to change over time. But that's the point of history, that history is the process of doing it as much as it is the answer that you get at the end. I was utterly fascinated by this idea that history was a conversation. I literally left class that day. I went directly to the registrar's office and I became a history major. I had no idea what I would do with a history major. I want to be super clear. My parents were both public school teachers. My dad taught social studies at an inner city school in Akron. My mom taught English in a suburban school outside of Akron. And they were a little bit frightened when I became a history major because they didn't see kind of the professional outcome. And so every year they would say to me, like, you need to get the secondary ed degree. And every year I would say to my parents, no, like, I'm not going to get a secondary ed degree. I'm studying history because I love it, right? Like when one of you talked about like liking history, that's why I studied history originally, because I loved it. I had no idea what the professional outcome was going to be. I was an idiot. I didn't care what the professional outcome was going to be. I loved it. And so I dedicated myself to studying it. And I graduated in 4 years. So here's a little bit more introduction. I didn't know what to do. So I stayed at Bowling Green and did a master's degree in history. That's 2 years. I wrote a thesis on the war in Vietnam, in particular, Lyndon Johnson's decision to massively escalate the war in 1965, July. And then when I finished, I still didn't know what I wanted to do. And long story short, got married, moved to El Paso where my wife was a teacher, and started teaching at the community college, and discovered that despite what I had told my parents, I really loved teaching. So I eventually went back to get a PhD. That was 5 years at the University of Cincinnati, wrote a thesis about Japanese American college students during World War II, finished, and then came to Misericordia. So I always studied history just because I loved it. I love this idea that it's a conversation. I love it that it is this fundamental search for truth. Like, who are we as individuals? Who are we as a community, as a society, as a nation, as humanity, really? If you don't like history, and you all do because you're here, unless you're here for extra credit, then maybe you don't. Like, I shouldn't judge you all too quickly, probably. But if you don't love history, I firmly believe it's only because you've never been introduced to the right way to think about it, or the right kinds of history that connect to you, because history connects to all of us, even if we don't see it. So that's where I got started. The more I've taught, the more I've become absolutely convinced that there are only two things that matter in life. Like, it all boils down to two things: community and stories. And they obviously reinforce each other. Communities tell stories, and those stories reinforce communities. But if you have community and you have shared stories, you can accomplish anything you want to. And if you don't have the community and you don't have the stories, like, what you're doing is doomed to failure. And I think history is fundamental to both the way we understand our communities and to the stories that we tell each other. And we tell those stories all the time, often in pop culture, even when we're not realizing that those stories are being told. So this is going to be super awkward again, because I don't know how well you can all see the screen, but I want to share something with you and kind of think about the stories we tell ourselves in a historical context and how they help us understand the world. By the way, often the stories we tell each other aren't true. Like, they're not historically grounded. They're not done in a responsible way. So it matters that we can kind of sort through it. But if I can figure out how to share the screen, I want to talk a little bit. All right, there we go. Okay, all right. So let me give you some quick background, and then I'll give you guys a chance to do some more talking. So after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, there's this great paranoia in the United States about Japanese Americans and Japanese American disloyalty. And on February 19th, 1942, the president, Franklin Roosevelt, signs Executive Order 9066. Essentially, that executive order gave the military the authority to designate military areas from which any or all persons could be excluded. They could define a geographic area and remove people from it. The executive order did not mention Japanese Americans specifically. It was super vague. But when Roosevelt signed it, he and everybody else involved knew that it was targeting only Japanese Americans. It was designed to remove Japanese Americans from the West Coast. And despite the fact that this was a massive violation of the civil rights of these Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were American citizens, most of the American public supported the idea that we should forcibly remove Japanese Americans from the West Coast and throw them in what were initially called concentration camps. But as we started to realize what was happening in Germany, we essentially rebranded. And so, like, concentration camps was not a good term. So we started using euphemisms like internment camps and things like that. I don't use internment myself because I think it's a euphemism, but if you're uncomfortable with concentration camp in America, incarceration camp is kind of the prevailing language. So all Japanese Americans on the West Coast, about 120,000, are rounded up, forced out of their homes, and sent to these 10 camps in the American interior. And again, almost all Americans supported it because of the stories that they were hearing and telling each other about Japanese Americans. So I want you guys to tell me, what's the story that's being told here? Like, what is this teaching us about Japanese Americans? So one of the things we see kind of, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but kind of like stretching up through the right side of this image is the West Coast of the United States. So we can see all the way from like Southern California all the way up to the Canadian border, right? All the way up California through Oregon into Washington. Good. So we're looking at a picture that's about the West Coast. And then towards the front, we see this guy kind of handing out TNT, right? Dynamite. What else do we see as we look at this image? Yeah. So there's a guy up here with the telescope. The Dr. Seuss thing, I think, really matters. So don't let me forget to come back to Dr. Seuss. So this is a political cartoon drawn by Dr. Seuss. I think it's 1942, might be early 1943. No, it's 1942. And the guy on the top with the telescope, he's looking across the Pacific, which means he's looking at what? Japan, right? So he's looking to Japan, and then we could read the title, Waiting for the Signal from Home. So what's that implying about the guy with the telescope? That despite the fact that he's Japanese American, his home is Japan, right? So the implication being the Japanese Americans are not really Americans, that they're living here, but they are fundamentally Japanese. Does anybody know what a fifth column is? Like on this little hut where all the TNT is being stored and handed out. Does anybody know what a fifth column is? A fifth column is a group that works from inside a society to destroy it. Right, sort of working covertly or secretly within the society to destroy it. So when it's labeled honorable fifth column, that's sarcastic, right? There's nothing honorable about Japanese Americans setting out to destroy the United States from within, but that's what they're doing. If you had to describe the Japanese Americans that you see here, how would you describe them? Number one, they're really happy, right? As they're picking up this TNT so they can go and do subversive things and destroy the United States from within. They're doing it really enthusiastically. The happiness matters in this, right? The Japanese Americans are not being forced to do this. They're not doing it against their will. They are excited and wholeheartedly in favor of this kind of activity. I think it matters that they all look the same too, because it plays to a long historical fear in the United States about what people called at the time the yellow peril. The idea that there were so many people in Asia that they would eventually spill over the Pacific Ocean and take over the United States. So as we watch them stretching all the way up the West Coast, as they become this faceless masses, they are literally the yellow peril. For the ones that we can see, they all look the same because they're depicted with what were kind of standard racist stereotypes in visual imaging of Japanese Americans: buck teeth, thick glasses, scraggly mustaches, in all of these ways, right? And importantly, this was a cartoon drawn by Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss is not a hard right-wing racist thinker. Dr. Seuss is, during the war, kind of like the person you know him as a children's book author, like a liberal guy who wants to build a better world. The point being, when Dr. Seuss is producing work like this, it is the mainstream American thought. The story we told ourselves about Japanese Americans during the war was that they could not be trusted, that they were out to get us. The end result was the unconstitutional and profoundly unjust mass incarceration of Japanese Americans. So the stories we tell each other matter. I have argued, and if you wanted to read something I've written, you can find this online at a website called The Vault of Culture. I have written an article called An Age of Superheroes that kind of studies those movies in the context of 9/11. And I argue that the superhero stories that we share with each other today were used by Americans immediately after 9/11 to try to process that trauma, to try to understand the world in which we live. The Dark Knight trilogy, I think, is precisely about 9/11. But the early Captain America movies, the Iron Man trilogy, all of these are films in which Americans are trying to understand what is the threat we face and what's the appropriate response, right? Because all of these superheroes play around with ideas like torture or extraordinary rendition, which is, going illegally across national boundaries to kidnap people so that you can interrogate them. They wrestle with electronic surveillance. All of the stories that you're consuming, whether you think about them or not, are teaching us who we are as Americans and what we stand for. And those stories then profoundly shape our community. So I could stop sharing this
You brought this up at the beginning, but I need to ask, what was the argument that you were making about President Lyndon Johnson's decision in the Vietnam War for your paper?
Yeah.
What my
Okay.
paper on?
Oh, really?
I
Okay.
went on the effects, so like the anti-war movements, and then I also talked about like the Tet Offensive and Lyndon Johnson and like how that like all came to be and like protests on the ground and like what that looks like with like Gallup polls. So I'm like, I'm interested as to what you were arguing.
Yeah, and so much of that that you're writing about comes almost directly out of July 1965. So historians see July 65 as the point of no return for the United States. It's when Lyndon Johnson chooses to massively escalate, right? Up until July 65, the United States has been escalating since Harry Truman was president in different kinds of ways. This is where hundreds of thousands of boots go on the ground. And I make the argument that essentially it was a bureaucratically driven position, that there were the extreme options. So you might know the name George Ball. He was like the big dissenter within the Johnson administration against the war. In July of 65, he says we have to pull out. Like if we don't pull out, the phrase he uses is once you're on the tiger's back, you don't get to choose when to dismount. Ball is arguing we need to get out. Like we can't win the war. It's a losing proposition. McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, is saying we should massively escalate. And it's actually a guy named Bundy who kind of presents Johnson with this middle ground that says instead of the massive escalation proposed by the Hawks or the withdrawal proposed by the Doves, that we can kind of continue. He kind of pitches it as a continuation of the Kennedy, Eisenhower, Truman policy. And so I think it's essentially bureaucratic politics that drives that decision and provides Johnson with kind of an easy answer. The stories we tell form the communities we live in. So I teach modern American history. I polled all of my students this week because we're talking about the history of today. How many of them trust politicians? I have 75 students in class right now. The number that raised their hand saying they trust politicians was a flat zero.
Yeah.
Not a single student said they trust politicians. Maybe your students are more trusting, but I'm going to guess that most of you are pretty cynical about politics. You imagine that politicians are in it for themselves, not for the greater good. Where does that come from? I would argue that it comes from 1968, and Ms. Younger, it comes in many ways from the Tet Offensive, or the Tet Offensive is at least part of that. In 1968, the stories we start telling ourselves start to shift and something breaks in America. Think about 1968 for a minute. Maybe you're not there in class yet, but 1968 is the year of the Tet Offensive. That's this massive communist offensive in Vietnam. It comes on the heels of Lyndon Johnson and General Westmoreland promising the American public, like, we've got this in hand. The communists are no longer able to launch any kind of major offensive. We're kind of mopping things up. And then this major offensive happens. This, I think, Ms. Younger, is what finally breaks faith in Lyndon Johnson, faith in the government, faith in the war, right? The Tet Offensive, eventually the Americans and the South Vietnamese push it back. Like, it's a military loss for the communists, but it's a huge public relations win for them. Like, it turns the public in a really profound way to think differently about the war. But that's not all that happens in 1968. That's early 1968. But soon after, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated, right? He's at a garbage workers strike in Memphis. He's come to a more radical critique of American racism, right? It's not just about bad individuals. It's systemic, and it's related to American foreign policy. He's speaking out against the war in Vietnam, and it's related to economics. Like, it's about poverty too. And he's shot down. A couple of months later, Robert Kennedy, who's jumped into the presidential campaign very late, but in many ways I think can be seen as the last idealistic liberal, is shot down right after he wins the California primary for the Democratic nomination. And so that means when the Democrats show up in Chicago for their nominating convention, it's a disaster. Tens of thousands of protesters show up in the street, and the end result is what historians call a police riot. There's rioting and violence all through Chicago, most of it instigated not by the protesters, but by the police, who were sent by a mayor who wanted to be a law and order guy and made his point by, beating up the people who were protesters. It's a disastrous year where all of the hope that Kennedy maybe arrived in 1960 with is dying by 1968. So that's also the year I was born, because I'm a really old guy. And so let me tell you my story and why I think that you're all so cynical today. Like, this is why our stories shape the community that we live in today. So I'm 5 years old. It's August 8th, 1974. My parents are youth group counselors for the Methodist Church. Are there any Methodists in the room? All right. So is it fair to say that every Methodist I've ever known was a very moderate person? But it's a very kind of bland Protestantism. Like, it's a very moderate religion. They were very moderate people politically. But they also own this little town called Lakeside up near Lake Erie in Ohio. So my parents were mentoring this youth group. So they took the youth group and me and my brother to Lakeside. And one night, again, August 8th, I can tell you the date precisely, 1974, we all got called down to the cafeteria. Now, when I tell you this story, it had such an impact on me as a 5-year-old kid that I can still like feel and smell it as I tell you this story. So we all gather in what was the cafeteria in Lakeside. Imagine like the roughest cafeteria you can. It's a big open space and it's filled with picnic benches. And the picnic benches are like 1970s style picnic benches. So the wood is really rough. If you like scoot side to side, you're definitely going to get a splinter. Like, as I tell the story, I can feel the wood against my legs and I can smell the fried fish in the air. Now, I will just warn you this, nobody should have been eating fish out of Lake Erie in the mid 1970s, but we didn't know any better. So like, whatever they caught, we would deep fry, and that's what. So you could literally, like, you could put your hand on the wall and you could feel the grease. Like, it's that kind of place. And so we all gather. It's a big group of Methodists. Again, if I had to describe their politics, I would describe their politics as beige, like the most neutral, moderate group of people I'd ever been around. I'd never heard any of them express anger. I had never heard any of them express a radical political position. They were moderate, salt of the earth people. And somebody brought a tiny little transistor radio to the front of the room, and they put it down on that picnic bench and they turned it on, and it was Richard Nixon, the president of the United States. And he's giving the speech in which he says he's going to resign the presidency. Now, I'm 5 years old. When Nixon comes on and I hear the president, I think the president is like a superhero, essentially. Like, we would never elect a bad person, right? We would only elect in politics, from my 5-year-old perspective, we would only elect the best of us. So Richard Nixon has to be the best of us. And he gives this speech and he kind of says, essentially, Congress won't support me anymore. People are out to get me. I'm going to resign. So I literally imagined Richard Nixon sneaking out the back door at the end of this speech and jumping on a helicopter to escape bad people who are out to get him, right? Because I'm still thinking in the pre-cynical way that we can trust politicians. And then the speech ends, right? Nixon says, I'm resigning, and he leaves. I'm imagining him like making this mad dash out the back door, and the Methodists start clapping. And I'm like, well, this is weird, but okay, like, they should be clapping, like Nixon has escaped bad guys. And then they stand up, and it's a freaking standing ovation. And I'm like, oh, they're really happy that Nixon has escaped. And then they stopped clapping and they started talking to each other. And I won't use the language they used because, you're high schoolers and I'm an adult. But I just say, I substantially expanded my curse word vocabulary that night. Because what they said when they were done clapping was, I'm glad they finally got that, beeping son of a. They used language I had never heard before. What I learned that night clearly was that politicians couldn't be trusted, right? Everything I thought I knew about the world was turned upside down. What I thought I could trust, what I thought was good, turned out to be untrustworthy and bad. And my generation, Gen X, I think, was profoundly affected by 1968 and by Watergate in a way that turned us into very cynical and apathetic people who should have done more. And instead, we're handing off to you a world in which you still have this really profound cynicism. That's the way in which stories shape like the very community in which we live. So anyway, that's why I think history matters. It's not just because I love it, because it shapes the fundamental stories that we tell ourselves that build the communities in which we live. And we can use those stories and we can use those communities to build something better in the world, or we can allow them to make the world less good. So that's why, for me, history matters.
So the story about like the Japanese American, did it like affect like any other like Eastern Asians?
It did. Oh, I'll let him, sorry.
Oh, no, please go ahead, Miss Younger, please.
Obviously, as we talked about with the political cartoon, they made every single Asian American, Japanese American look the same. So in that same vein, because that was a rhetoric that was going on at the time, everyone thought that every Asian American person was from Japan, or they just wrongly made that assumption. So like, I mean, it happened with the TikTok ban the other day, like with our own Congress, like being like, oh my gosh, Mr. What is it, Chow, I think it is, you're from China. And he goes, I can't say this enough, I'm from Singapore. So like, it's kind of that same like associating like, oh, I don't know where, associating with, like Japanese Americans are like, oh, so they so Chinese Americans, even though they don't look similar to Japanese Americans because of the fear and the rhetoric of like, oh, they all look the same. A lot of other Asian Americans were subject to either like violence or just like losing jobs or just like hostility in the environment. And then some Asian Americans were fortunate enough to not go through that, but a lot of Asian Americans were affected at the time due to them associating all Asian Americans with Japanese Americans.
Yeah, and if I could build on that, that was a problem because China was an ally in the war. And in many ways, we kind of imagined, this is pre-communist revolution, of course, that China would be kind of an important ally in the post-war world. And so the government kind of works with the media. There's a famous Time magazine article, I think it's 1943, 1944, where they, it's a really racist set of cartoons where they try to like teach people to tell the difference between Japanese and Chinese Americans. Like it's really awful. It turns out that racism tends to obscure nuance and like create these very broad, if hateful and completely ignorant understandings of different Asian American groups. So yeah, it's a great question. And it's a tragic moment in lots of ways in American history.
My first question is, what is your like favorite like time period in history?
That's a hard question. I will say though, the more I teach, I really like post 45 American history. I like teaching it at the college level because what I've discovered is a lot of students arrive at college having taken a lot of history, but that American history often doesn't get much past maybe World War II or Vietnam, that it's this huge blank spot. And honestly, you guys live in a world in which impeachment is just like something you do with a drop of a hat. Like you're surrounded by impeachment. But how do you understand impeachment if you don't understand the history of Nixon, right? Or you live in the era that I would argue that we still live in the age of Reagan. Not that Reagan shaped it all, but Reagan is kind of the avatar for the political era in which we still live. Well, how can you come to grips with living in the age of Reagan if you've never studied Reagan historically? And like Reagan is like, he seems like contemporary events to me. Like I grew up with Reagan, and there's so many things that Americans think they know about Reagan, and we'd be much better off if we complicated that a little bit and understood Reagan as like a human being. Like he's no more a superhero or a supervillain than any of the rest of us. So if I had to pick, I think I would pick post-war American history. I'm old enough now that it can be like stuff that I know, like personally, and I think that matters to me. It's kind of cool to like take on the challenge of writing history that I lived. So yeah, that would be my answer. I love all history, to be clear, but it's the post-war stuff that I'm most excited about. I'm teaching an upper level post-war US next spring, and I can't wait to teach it. It's such a great class to teach.
And my other question was, who's your favorite superhero?
I feel really bad because when I wrote the book, and Mr. Gribos can he can give you the citation if you want to buy it. Yeah, for sure. Not that you do. But when I wrote it, we did a lot of press and people were always asking, who's your favorite superhero? And I always felt like this obligation to respond. But I don't really have a favorite anything. I'm weird that way. But when I grew up, my favorite comic book to read was X-Men. So my answer would be not a hero, but like a team or a universe. Like it is X-Men. And I know there's a new Disney Plus thing that I haven't started yet, X-Men 97, that I need to catch up on. But so it would be X-Men. And I think in many ways I didn't realize it, but when I was reading X-Men as a kid, it was about diversity. It was about multiculturalism. It was addressing issues in what seems like a throwaway form, right? Comic books, we all know, are not serious, they're for kids, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the reading X-Men got me thinking about issues like that in a way that I wouldn't have otherwise. And it's why it's really important whenever you're consuming pop culture that you think about those underlying messages, right? Pop culture is, I assure you, always trying to sell you something, and not just shirts and shoes and Big Macs. It's selling you values, it's selling you worldviews, it's teaching you how to think about the world. And it's really easy to become a victim of that, right? So one of the things I think post-45 history is great for teaching is we can deal with a lot of pop culture kinds of materials and start building skills about how do we see through what they're doing to make them meaningful for ourselves. So yeah, in terms of the superhero movies, I think Iron Man 3 is way underrated, in part because it really tries to address, I think, issues of race and the war on terror. No, am I wrong? Are you shaking your head? What do I have wrong about Iron Man 3?
You've opened up two more questions for me, so
I just don't like Iron Man 3. But I know, I get what you're saying.
I think Iron Man 3, what it does with the Mandarin in thinking about race and the war on terror, thinking about what Ms. Younger was saying earlier, in terms of the way that we conflate all of these people together as the enemy once we racialize them. Iron Man 3 tries to wrestle with that a little bit. It's also a film that makes the argument that we create our own enemies. That's kind of the voiceover that starts the film. And I think it's trying to get us to ask questions about the war on terror. Now it's a Marvel movie, so it ultimately can't get to where it needs to get, but it at least tries. But the Captain America trilogy is also really, really good. Winter Soldier is just a good movie, not a good superhero movie.
When you say that we are living in Reagan's the effects of Reagan, can you just expand on that a little bit more? Because I feel like you were talking about how a lot of people idolize him.
In terms of the age of Reagan, again, because we idolize him, we give him more credit. I see him more as kind of a figurehead for a movement that started before him. So I think the age of Reagan actually starts getting built in the 1960s. And it's the counter reaction to the war protest you were talking about. It was the counter protest to the movement culture, the rise of feminism, the civil rights movement radicalizing, the Asian American movement really sort of takes root in the late 60s. The gay rights movement, all of this movement culture provokes a conservative backlash to it. And there's been a really good scholarship done on sort of the direct mailing empire that was built. They would reach out, so we didn't have the internet, right? So it would be mailers that you would send out to people to try to build a kind of movement. And I think when we talk about the 60s, we talk about the left-wing movements all the time. And in doing that, we miss the way in which the right was building a movement that would eventually get us to Nixon, but beyond Nixon to Reagan and to where we are today. And so in many ways, the age of Reagan doesn't start with Reagan. I would argue it really starts in the mid-60s. It begins to take root in our institutions in the 70s. And we're kind of living with it institutionally, but also culturally, right? Much of the way we think about the world is conditioned on these mythical ideas we have about Reagan. And that's why I want to teach post-45 history, right? I am completely uninterested in teaching a history of superheroes and supervillains, right? That's one thing I know for sure. History is not populated by superheroes and supervillains. It's populated by real people. And our job as historians is to try to understand them on their own terms first, and then to start building out larger conclusions. So does that answer your question? To me, that's where it comes from, is that what we've completely forgot about the late 60s is the right-wing response to protest and movement culture that gets us to where we are today.
So a lot of discourse online has like talked about how a lot of Marvel movies kind of idolize like militarism and using weapons and all of that. And I wanted to talk about like, do you think that because of the pop culture of like superheroes movies, like in the last post 9/11, do you think that's having an effect on how we handle ourselves, like how we view militarism, and like why, I guess, people aren't fazed by the fact that there are like there's so much going on in the world right now, like Israel and Palestine, like with Russia and Ukraine, and it feels like people aren't as like, I don't know, sensitive to it or like just aware of it, I feel. And I want to know if you think like I don't know what word I'm looking for here, like popular superhero movies, like, do you think that has an effect on how we treat the rest of the world with like wars and
Yeah, I do. I think that I think of pop culture as kind of like as a feedback loop. It reflects broader attitudes, but then it shapes those attitudes, right? And it kind of creates this vicious cycle of reflecting and shaping and reflecting and shaping. So I know the one student was skeptical about Iron Man 3, but to me, Iron Man 3 and the Captain America movie, The Winter Soldier, are the two films that most directly try to kind of address, I think what you're talking about in some ways is the military-industrial complex and the way in which we're all implicated in it, but we never think about the way in which we are implicated in it. And so, you know, Tony Stark is, of course, the military-industrial complex. Iron Man 3 tries to like turn him into something different, right? Killian is the real military-industrial complex. And Killian says essentially, I created the war on terror. Like I created the Mandarin. The Mandarin doesn't exist. He's an actor. Sorry, spoiler alert, that I hired to create, this terror because I can make money. So the film is meant to kind of criticize that, I think. But the problem is the only answer Iron Man has for it is to deploy his military-industrial complex. Right? If we're expecting vigilantes, and one way that we might think about superheroes is that they are vigilantes. They operate outside the law, imposing their own justice, right? As long as we're relying on that, we're never going to question the military-industrial complex. We're just questioning like good versions of it and bad versions of it. For example, in The Dark Knight, Batman does pretty much everything the Bush administration did to fight the war on terror. Extraordinary rendition. Yeah, he goes and gets Lau out of, I can't remember where Lau is, Singapore or whatever, and brings him back to Gotham. He does electronic eavesdropping. He does torture, right? It's a film that kind of is getting us to think about what we were doing in the war on terror. But my read of that film is that ultimately, because Batman's doing it, it's okay, right? We can trust Batman. He's a good guy. And that is a completely inadequate answer to the question that you're posing. I feel as if the superhero genre kind of comes with limits built into it that make it very difficult for it to criticize fully what I think the Winter Soldier wants to criticize, what I think Iron Man 3 wants to criticize. They want to criticize it, but they're also part of the Disney empire. They're also part of these mega movies that have to make how many gazillion dollars to justify budget and to continue making them. And ultimately, when you've got that commercial imperative, it's always going to blunt the social criticism that you might be trying to make. So to me, I see Marvel inching up towards a critique of what you're talking about, but ultimately I see Marvel always pulling its punches at the end, glancing away from the issue at the end.
How would someone who studies history and is very familiar with like militarism and like what goes on in the United States and outside of the United States, how would I get history people, like people who are not interested in history, to think about those kinds of things like when they watch these films? So like, how do I get them to, instead of like engaging with it as like just a regular piece of media, how do I engage them with, well, this is actually a deeper conversation beyond like just, ooh, fireworks, ooh, like someone shooting someone else. Like, let's look at this because I think because we're in such a time where superhero movies have impacted the youth, they're gonna grow up and think that like militarism is normal. And I don't know if I agree with that, but I wanna like try to change that narrative if I can and bring awareness to it if I can.
Right. And also really get people to question their assumptions, right? Because the thing about the pop culture is we just assume these things and so we don't question them. And that's the danger of it. So I'm lucky. I teach a film and history class where I can spend an entire semester watching film, breaking it down and making it meaningful in a cultural, historical
Like,
sense.
perfect curriculum, like literally like post 40s, like
Yeah.
and history through film. That
The last time I taught history through film, it was a post 45 class, maybe because that's like my favorite thing to teach in part, but also because like there's so much stuff to look at. So I also taught a class for a while here on graphic narrative and race. I co-taught it with somebody in the English department. My favorite part in either one of those classes was invariably a student would leave at the end of the semester and say, "You ruined movies for me." And I would like, I'd be like, "I'm sorry," but secretly in my brain, I'm thinking, yeah, like that's the point. So like one of my mentors at Ms. when I first got here, Don Fries, won the teaching award a gazillion times. Everybody loved him. He always told me, remember history is a story. Remembers history is a story. And that's one of the ways that we can engage people is by pulling them in with good stories, right? Good storytelling can get people in the door. And then if you don't have time for movies, I look at clips all the time in my classes. There's some really great Superman cartoons from World War II. If we had more time today, I would have shown you one called Japateurs that makes the same argument as Dr. Seuss. It's Superman going to war against Japanese American saboteurs. So finding shorter things because it's like an 8-minute cartoon, but finding those short things that you can intersperse to get people actually doing it. I don't know how else to get them there except to encourage people to do it.
Right.
And then after you've done that for a while, then you go watch Iron Man 3 and you can then think, well, this is what it's trying to do. And here's how it's succeeding and failing. And then most importantly, here's what it means to me. Not just accepting on face value whatever it's trying to cram down your throat, but interacting it with it in a way that like it's meaningful for you. I tell students all the time in my classes, I do not expect that you're going to think like me when the class is done. I'm a Quaker pacifist. Nobody thinks like me. I'm a vegan Quaker pacifist, right? There's no way anybody ever leaves a classroom being like, that's who I want to be. Like, that's my model intellectually. But I do demand of students, well, I don't demand anything, but I ask them as insistently as I can that they think about the stuff and they own it for themselves. Because that's what history is about, right? It's what it should be about, not regurgitating what I think about history, but having the skills to engage the past and construct your own meaning for it.
So like somewhere during like the civil rights movement, like when like African American people were like trying to get like equality, wasn't there like some sort of like Asian rights movement that was also kind of like with it, but then after like a certain point kind of like split off?
Yeah. So like what you see across the 60s is what seemed like a more unified movement fragmenting. And so out of that fragmentation comes the Asian American movement that really sort of comes into its own in the 1970s, but is growing out of the civil rights movement. Feminism grows out of the civil rights movement. The gay rights movement grows out of the civil rights movement. So, maybe my presentation of the age of Reagan is a little pessimistic. There's a lot of really important identity movement and reform movement that continues into the 70s and beyond. But yeah, I guess have you all seen the picture of 1968, the Olympics in Mexico City, where the two African-American track stars for the United States put up their fists in a Black Power kind of salute? It's really powerful for African Americans. It alienates a lot of other people who are part of that movement, right? Who imagined that we were building to something more inclusive, as groups like SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, increasingly sort of sideline white activists and say it needs to be Black people who do this work. It's fragmenting that movement. A lot of women found the civil rights movement an uncomfortable place to be. It was not particularly open-minded about empowering women. And one of the impetuses behind the feminist movement is women leaving the civil rights movement and saying, like, we need to work on our issues, right? Which is the same with the Asian American movement. It's really, Americans don't talk about what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II until the 1970s. And a large part of what pushes Americans to talk about it is that Asian American movement, saying we have to hold our country accountable for this. And in 1988, Reagan signed legislation that provided an official apology to Japanese Americans and reparations. It was $20,000 to every survivor. So you still had to be alive in the late 80s, early 90s to collect the check. The $20,000 doesn't come close to capturing the financial loss that Japanese Americans suffered during the war, but it's seen as a way of trying to give the apology some weight. But it hardly fixes things. I'm about to publish an essay on romance novels in Japanese American incarceration. Speaking about like Mr. Grybos, things I never thought I would say out loud. Like if you told me 20 years ago I was going to write about Danielle Steele, I would have been like, that's the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard. But, you know, here I am and I'm writing it and trying to make the argument that whatever the apology might have accomplished for Japanese Americans and for racial equality, that romances in the 90s actually undo a lot of that by trying to turn what was done to Japanese Americans into kind of a redemptive things for white people. It's really weird what Danielle Steele and David Gutterson are doing with romance in the 90s.
In my view, I'm sure you have a better understanding of this. I do see so many movements today, and I see kind of that spirit coming back. And then at the same time, I see the pendulum swinging the other way.
I think you're right, Mr. Grybus. I think we sit at a really interesting moment historically. The world is really dangerous, right? If young people should pay attention to politics for any reason, it's Gaza, Taiwan, Ukraine. Like there are trends in the world that we should be paying attention to because they are potentially very impactful and very dangerous and very deadly to us. Like that's just like the ugly truth of it. I do feel as if, and it's really hard, let me say, to write history when like at the moment you're living. Like it's hard to get that perspective. But I think that you're onto something there, John. I think that we are at a tipping point in American history, potentially, right? Where we have some pretty stark choices that we're looking at. And I wish history gave me some confidence in knowing which way we were going to go. But the truth of the matter is, I mean, American politics has always tended to swing back and forth. The Taiwan story, of course, comes out of World War II, and well, especially the Chinese Communist Revolution, which happens in 1949, the nationalists retreat to the island. The Chinese have never really willingly acknowledged that Taiwan is not part of China. And if you're paying attention to China now, like there is a substantial military buildup, there is an expansion, a projection of Chinese power into the Pacific, kind of further and further into the Pacific. Throughout American history, or the history of the Cold War, like there are multiple times where shots were fired over the islands of Quemoy and Matsu that kind of lay in between. Like it's always been this latent issue. It seems clear that the Chinese are becoming more aggressive in the way that they are addressing that issue. And Taiwan is seen as an American ally. And so if the Chinese push too hard, what does that look like? I mean, not that I would go to TikTok where you get all of the alarmist kind of stuff going on, but like, you'll see people talking about like, what does that war look like if China invades Taiwan? How does the United States get involved? The world is, again, very, very complicated right now and kind of thinking that through. But like that's a history that most Americans just don't know, right? That there is this kind of long contestation of that territory.
What do we know about history as Americans, and where do you rank us? And you can be frank if you want.
I wish people understood how much fun history is. I wish people understood that like there are all these great stories. We do not know history very well. To the point Ms. Younger made earlier, people lionize Reagan, but they don't know who he was. Like they can't name a single policy. They don't understand Nixon. Like the short answer is not good, and we ought to be somewhat ashamed of ourselves, and we ought to do better. it is, I think, not a it's not a surprise or not a mistake that we see a movement to kind of try to limit or police what's taught in history classrooms. I think we all ought to be very concerned about that. You know, studying American history requires sometimes we study stuff that's unpleasant or unethical or what was done to Japanese Americans. It doesn't mean you love your country any less. Maybe you love it more because you're willing to kind of address the shortcomings as well as the accomplishments. But that movement, it concerns me. If we do not know our history, we do not know who we are. If we do not know our history, we do not know what has worked and what hasn't worked. If we do not know our history, we can't address the problems that we face today to build something better. History is fundamental to all of that. And to ignore history or to just cling to myths instead of really wrestling with it is to invite continued problems instead of solutions.
My next question was going to be what your biggest concern is, but I think you've answered that. And my other question was going to be where you see history in the US going, but I think you might have also answered that with you talking about the political shifts. I don't know if you want to say anything about either of those.
One of my big concerns is the idea that we can't or that like the media is all fake news, or that we can't sort through it. We can. Like, one of the reasons history is so important is because a good history education teaches you to sort through information. It teaches you to think critically. It teaches you not to rely upon one news source, but to look at lots of different news sources, to fact check on your own. Those skills are so important, and they are so central to what we do as historians, right? As a historian, I don't get to write whatever I want. I do the research, I collect the evidence, I write it up, and then it goes out to peer review to at least 2 or 3 people who don't know it's from me. I don't know who they are, who critique it and make it better. And then I revise it. And eventually it becomes a Danielle Steele article that'll be published in the next couple of months, hopefully. But like, that's what we need. Like, my concern is nobody wants to do that work anymore. My concern is that it's easier for Americans to live in the bubble, whichever bubble it is, the CNN bubble or the MSNBC bubble or the Fox bubble or the Newsmax bubble, that we've gotten really comfortable not thinking. So if I had to cite my biggest concern, it's that sometimes I fear we don't want to think, which I don't understand at all. Like, I became a historian because Larry Friedman taught me, man, it's really cool to think about stuff. Like, there's nothing better than thinking about stuff. I have the best job in the world. I'm gonna put it out there. Like, you couldn't have a better job.
Thank you, Dr. Austin. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate the chance to have a conversation.